The following provides a basic guide to doing the paper in the ethics class. Now, the paper is intended to be written in basically two stages, a draft version and a final version. Now, there are the following due date and deadlines regarding the paper. The draft due date, as specified in the syllabus, is kind of a suggested date by which you should turn in a draft if you are very concerned about your grade in the class in terms of needing it to graduate, keep a scholarship or fellowship, or otherwise maintain a particular grade. If you don't turn in a draft by the due date, absolutely nothing happens. If you do turn in a draft by then of course I'll grade the draft, put comments on it, get it back to you. Now, regarding the draft, kind of the critical date is the draft deadline, as specified on the syllabus. This is the last time that I'll be able to look at the draft and get it back to you with comments on it. Now, in terms of the way the deadline date works, basically it works like this. If you turn a draft paper in before the deadline, I'll look at it as quickly as possible. It takes me about 15 minutes to read a draft, during my office hours, out of my office hours. And so if you drop it off during those times, if you want to wait, I can get it back to you in about 10-15 minutes. Or if you just want to drop it off, I can get it back to you later, and definitely by the next class. Now, the draft deadline date, though, is sort of the last minute of desperation for the draft. On that day, I'll look at drafts during my office hours. And what I'll do is I'll look at the papers in the order that I get them, and I'll take the time that I have left and divide that by the number of drafts. So if I've got, say, an hour and 6 drafts, then everybody gets 10 minutes. If I've got an hour and, say, 20 drafts, then everyone gets 3 minutes. So obviously it's better to turn in drafts as early as possible. Now, if you turn in a draft on the day of the draft deadline and I don't get to it, it becomes a final draft automatically, unless you put on the paper that it should not be read and treated as a final draft. In that case, when time runs out, I won't look at the draft. I'll simply wait for the final version to be turned in. Now, in terms of the actual deadlines for the final version, there are basically 3 deadlines in order of basically goodness. The best one is to turn the paper in by the on-time bonus deadline, which is specified in the syllabus. If you turn the paper in by that deadline, you get 5 points added to the paper score for turning it in on time. Now, if you run into some sort of difficulty regarding, say, your computer or life in general or whatever, you still have until the emergency deadline to turn the paper in, which is specified on the syllabus. If you turn the paper in by the emergency deadline, you get 100% credit on the paper, that is to say full credit, but you don't get the 5-point on-time bonus because obviously enough the paper is not on time. Now, the bonus for the on-time paper is for having the paper done on time. So the paper has to be done on time to get that bonus. If you have like an excuse why you missed the on-time bonus or something else, essentially that doesn't matter. Again, because the bonus is for turning it in on time, not for having an excuse for not turning it in on time. But if you get it to me by emergency deadline, you get the full credit. Now, the third and final deadline is the 50% deadline. That is also specified on the syllabus in terms of the exact date. If I get the paper by then you would get half credit. Now, half credit is obviously not as good as full credit, but it's better than 0 credit. The syllabus also includes a lot of details about extensions, etc. Since it's all spelled out in painful detail in the syllabus, I won't go over that. But essentially, getting extension requires rather extreme circumstances. Things like waiting till the last minute and having your computer crash, or waiting till the last minute and going to, say, the library and having your paper, vanish. Those don't count as extensions. Extensions can be requested in serious cases. For example, if you're in the National Guard and you're deployed overseas, you qualify for an extension. If you're in a terrible accident and you break both your hands, you qualify for an extension. If you get the flu for a couple days or a week, you don't qualify for an extension. If your computer has some trouble, you don't qualify for an extension. But again, all that's spelled out in painful detail on the syllabus. Now, as far as turning the paper in, basically works like this. If you're doing a draft version of the paper, turn that into me as a printed copy. I'll mark it up, put comments on it, get it back to you as soon as possible. Now with the final version of the paper, that's turned in electronically through Blackboard Safe Assign. That way it goes and automatically checks it for possible cases of plagiarism. Now, the checking of plagiarism is pretty enthusiastic, so if a paper gets flagged, I don't just take Safe Assign's word for it. I go in and, of course, and check it, because basically what it gives me the chance to do is check out to see if their plagiarism has occurred. Now, if you want comments written on your paper, then you need to turn in a printed copy as well, but you also need to turn the paper in through Blackboard. So the paper that gets turned into Blackboard is the final version, and again, you also need to turn in a printed copy if you want comments on it. And the reason for that is because when I look at it on Blackboard to grade it, I view it through Word's feature of basically protected viewing. So viruses and crap hopefully can't cause trouble. If you want me to put comments on it, got to get the printed copy. If you just want to grade, just don't turn in the printed copy, turn it in just purely through Blackboard. But again, for the paper to be considered properly turned in, it's got to be turned in through Blackboard Safe Assign. And this is spelled out in great detail, also in the paper guide. So the basic idea is if you want to get a draft looked at it, get it in by the draft deadline. If you want to get the 5-point bonus, turn it in by the on-time deadline. If you want to just get full credit but not 5 points, turn it in by the emergency deadline. If you want to get half credit, turn it in by the 50% deadline. If you want to get nothing, don't turn it in. Now again, the paper has to be turned in through Blackboard and Safe Assign. If you want written comments on your paper, you also have to turn in a printed copy of the paper by the appropriate deadline. Whichever version is turned in last, that is considered the turn-in time for the paper. Now, there's a degree of subjectivity when grading a paper, even though, of course, I've got painful and detailed rubrics for going through them and a clear setup in terms of how the paper is to be done. There's always grounds for discussing the grade. Now, if you believe that the grade on the paper is not what the paper actually deserves, you can come in during my office hours, bring in, of course, a copy of the paper to discuss with me, and I'll be happy to listen to your case as to why the grade on the paper should be higher. Now, this involves making a case for the change of the grade. Reasons such as a person needs a higher grade to graduate or get a scholarship or fellowship, or to get a reward from one's parents. Those are not reasons for increasing the grade. The basic idea is when I go and put comments on it, it'll show the things that I think that need to be improved in the paper, and the grade discussion involves you showing to me why my assessment was off base. So essentially you have to make your case as to why the grade should be changed. My case as to why the grade should be the way it is based on the comments. So in a sense, at that point, the burden of proof is on you for me to change the grade. Now with the grade discussion, it's kind of a no-risk, scenario. If you come in to discuss your grade, your paper grade cannot be lowered. So if you go in with an 83, the worst you come out with is an 83, with one exception. If it turns out, if I discover at that point that the paper was plagiarized, then the grade, of course, could be lowered. But with the exception of plagiarism, a grade discussion cannot result in a lowered grade. It can only result in the grade staying the same or improving. Now, speaking of plagiarism is something you definitely want to avoid. The basic idea of plagiarism is attempting to pass off someone's work as one's own. And this can be done, accidentally. A person simply forgets to put in the citations and so forth, or obviously it can be done intentionally, simply copying from a web page. Now, the way to avoid plagiarism is to properly cite anything you use from other sources, be it Wikipedia, books, etc., and be sure to follow the appropriate guidelines for whatever you use in your major. I'm not going to require to use a new citing method, so if you use MLA, Chicago style, AP, or whatever, you can use that. As long as it's a professional academic citing method, it's acceptable. But whenever you use material from other sources, be sure to cite it. And again, it runs through Safe Assign. That's pretty good at flagging plagiarism. I'll also check on cases as well. If a paper is plagiarized, basically this is how I handle it. I'll just put print up the report, put a big 0 on it, put the person's name on it, turn it back. The person knows what they did. I know what they did. There's nothing to discuss. There's no negotiation. There's no rewrite. Plagiarism is just pretty much a guaranteed zero, with, of course, the exciting possibility of academic misconduct charges. So you really want to avoid plagiarism. Now, I do understand that people have a lot of other classes, life is difficult and busy, and so people often get caught up. When it's near the deadline for for the paper, sometimes what people do is they panic and they go, look at Wikipedia and they say, "Oh, Wikipedia, save me." Or they go to one of those sites that provides papers for free or even buying them, and they print them up and turn them in. And I catch a few people every year. But you definitely want to avoid that because the risk is pretty high, especially with safe assign, and of course getting caught for plagiarism is bad. So sort of my view is if you're in the scenario where you're thinking about plagiarizing something, you're better off just sitting down and basically writing the paper as well as you can and turning in something that is your own work. Because even if it's really like awful, you at least get some points for it probably, whereas plagiarism would be pretty bad. Now, turn to the next stuff, the actual writing the paper itself. Here's basically how to do the stuff. The paper is a case paper. In other words, what you're doing is picking a particular case. I have the case files on the website for the course, also available via Blackboard. And there's, 30 plus cases there, ranging from things like the ethics of cheating in a relationship to things like, the ethics of CEO compensation, the ethics of privacy, the ethics of same-sex marriage, the ethics of stem cell research, the ethics of lying, all kinds of ethical issues. So the first objective basically is to pick your case, what you're writing about. Now, if you don't like any of the cases that are available, you have the option of creating your own case. And of course, you can go and look at the news. There's always ethical cases coming up in order to get a case you want to write about. Now, if you go off on your own and pick a case, what I require is that you check with me. It's not so that I can crush your creativity or deny you the opportunity to write about something you want to write about. It's basically to protect your grade. Because if someone writes a paper about something that has nothing to do with ethics, and they turn it in, say, on the deadline of the paper, that would be bad. And so it's a good idea to check with me beforehand to avoid that disaster. Now, again, it doesn't take very long. You don't have to come in person. You can send me an email saying I'd like to write about this particular case, the following issue, and I'll, respond back saying yes, you can do that, or no, you should change it to something else. What people often want to do is recycle a paper from another class, say psychology or history or whatever, and so that's where the problem usually comes up. But again, you can write about anything in ethics, but if it's not one of the pre-approved cases, be sure to check with me, at least send me an email just to make sure, because it's better to hear, in a short email saying why, basically it's not an ethics case, than finding out on the paper deadline and getting a, 0 on the paper. Now, once you pick your case, what you want to write about, then the idea is to find the particular issue. And it's typically of the form whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable. For example, if someone picks a case, say, on cheating in a relationship, they might focus on the issue of whether revenge cheating is morally acceptable or not. Or they may sort of update it to, current technology and address the issue of whether virtual cheating, that is to say, engaging in cheating not through any physical contact, but through the use of, say, those online, massive multiplayer online games like Warcraft or something, or Second Life, and engaging in virtual cheating. And so the idea is to find that issue. Again, whether or not something is right or wrong. It may be whether virtual cheating is moral or not. It may be something like whether stem cell research is immoral or not. It may be whether lying to advance one's career is moral or not. Those sorts of things. Now, once you get your case, the general topic you're writing on, and the particular issue you're writing on, you need to come up with your position on the issue. Namely, the issue is whether revenge cheating is acceptable or not. You need to decide on your position. Typically, it will be yes, it's acceptable, no, it's not. And you only need one position. Because the idea is not to explore all the sides of the issue, but to take a definite position and argue for that position. Now, once you get your position on the issue, you'll want to sort of brainstorm a bit and think of reasons that support your position. In other words, ask yourself, why logically should someone else believe that I'm right about my position on this issue? And come up with as many reasons as you can think of. Now, you'll want to sort through them in order to pick out a few of the best ones. But, when you're brainstorming, you could do this formally, writing it out or typing it out, or just kind of running it through in your mind. Then you should consider the objections that can be raised against your view. Basically, reasons why someone might logically and rationally think you're mistaken. And of course, you'll want to think of replies to those objections. So basically, the objectives are pick your general topic, the case. It could be, for example, cheating in the relationship. Then pick your particular issue, which could be something like whether cheating is right or wrong. Then your position on the issue, which may be something like my position is cheating in a relationship is morally wrong. And then you can think of reasons that support your position. For example, some obvious reasons might be the various harms that could come about from cheating. Things like, STDs, emotional damage, the keying of cars, pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, etc. Then you'd want to consider objections. For example, the way someone may respond to, say, an argument about the harms, a person may object to that argument by saying, well, if someone can avoid getting caught, they can avoid all those harms and enjoy all the positive things. And then, of course, an obvious reply to that is, well, generally people do get caught because people are generally not as smart as they think they are. Now, of course, it's had to be developed in a lot more detail, but that's basically the approach. Pick your case, pick your issue, your position on the issue, think of the reasons that support your position, think of objections against your position, and then replies to those objections. Now, the paper itself breaks into 4 parts. Now, when doing the paper, be sure to label the 4 sections. And the reason for this is purely practical. It's for grading. So when I grade each of the sections, I grade it based on a rubric or set of standards. So when you label them, you're basically telling me, this is the section, that's the introduction. So you grade it like the introduction. Here's my argument. So grade that as the argument. Here's my objection reply. Grade that. Here's my conclusion. Grade that part. If the paper doesn't have any sections labeled and all kind of runs together, I'll just kind of have to guess at it. And another reason you want to do it is because labeling the sections, avoids the penalty of -1 point per section not labeled. And the reason why I put the penalty in there is basically because it makes it harder for me to grade it. So be sure to label the sections. The first one is the introduction. The second part is the argument. The third part is objection and reply. And the fourth and final part is the conclusion. Now, turning to the first part, the introduction, it's worth 5 points. So you'll want to plan your efforts accordingly. It should be 125 words, basically half a normal page or less. Now, if you're going on, for like a couple pages, it's definitely too long. So it should be 125 words or less. In fact, you could probably do it in about, 5 sentences or less. Now, the particular content is this. First, you got to include there a thesis statement, which basically gives the purpose of the paper. To be very kind of boring about it, here's a very precise example. The purpose of this essay is to discuss and assess the morality of charging larger airline passengers extra for their flights. The second thing to do is have your case statement. Identify the case you'll be addressing. For example, I might say, I will be addressing case X, the ethics of flying fat. Next, your position statement. Clearly state your position on the issue, which would be this. It is my considered opinion that it is morally acceptable to charge larger passengers for a second seat or an upgrade. Fourth, present your argument statement. Briefly state what arguments of your own you will present. as well as, of course, your objections, etc. For example, I will say, I will defend my position by making use of analogies, making an appeal to rights, and consider objections against my view. Finally, you want to present some minimal relevant background. The idea is basically to set the stage for the reader. For example, while some airlines have been discussing implementing such a policy, some of them have actually put it into practice, thus leading to a controversy in the air regarding the billing of passengers for being bigger. So the idea is basically I look at it when I grade it. If those 5 points are there, you get 5 points. If not, he gets less. Again, you want to keep it pretty short because it's not worth a whole lot of points. Now, the big points of the paper are in the next two sections, the argument section and the objection and reply section. The argument section is worth 50 points out of the 100 for the paper. In terms of its size, thanks to the joys of the Gordon rule, it's got to be at least 1,000 words because you got to hit that Gordon rule word count. So that's about 4 pages normal sized. In terms of the formatting, basically I don't obsess about formatting, but the way to do it is normal formatting, double space, have the normal margins, half inch, inch, either one's fine. If you want to say paper, go with a half inch, and use like a normal 12-point font, nothing like weird or unusual. And it should be printed obviously in black ink or black toner on white paper. None of the kind of weird stuff like printing like orange on purple paper or something. Just kind of ask yourself, would you like to sit down and read, say, 100 papers like that? That's kind of a general guide. Now, getting to the particular content, here's what should be in the argument. First, you'll begin your argument by providing some case information. In other words, talking about your case, your issue, your position for the issue, so the reader knows what you're talking about. This is worth 10 points. So you don't want to go on and on and on about this part of the paper because the idea is it's only worth 10 points. Now, depending on what sort of topic you're writing on, you may have more or less in the case information. For example, if you're writing about cheating in a relationship, that can be pretty concise because everyone pretty much knows what cheating is. And so you don't have to provide a great deal of background about cheating. Now you don't have to provide a lot of reporting on it. So if you're writing about cheating, for example, you don't have to go and spend pages talking about statistics and why people psychologically cheat and what people do when they cheat. It can be very concise. You could say, well, people engage in cheating, and by cheating I mean this, and briefly describe it. Now if you're doing something that's much more say unusual, a much more complicated sort of case in terms of the background, something like stem cell research, or something like an unusual variant, like talking about virtual cheating, for example, then you want to provide more information. But keep in mind, first, it's only worth 10 points, so you don't want to spend page after page just to get 10 points. And also, this is an argumentative paper. It's not a report or compare and contrast or background paper. So the idea is present enough information so the reader knows what you're talking about, but not so much that you're just wasting your effort for no points. Now, a way to tell how much information you should have is basically 3 ways. One way is bring me the paper, have me look at it. Way 2, take a look at the sample paper in the paper guide on the website or on Blackboard, and that shows you about how much background you should have for your typical case. Third approach is to go and look at other essays written, say, on professional blogging sites or like the Huffington Post, and see how much background they give for an argumentative blog post, and sort of plan accordingly. But again, the best way to do it is basically have me look at it or ask me how much should I say. Now the big chunk of the points here, basically 80%, 40 out of the 50, is actually arguing for your position. You've got to make your case and provide arguments. And there are other, going over in class and other videos about how to argue. And you might develop, say, an argument by analogy, or an appeal to consequences, or have multiple arguments. So the big chunk of the points is presenting developed arguments for your position. as I mentioned earlier, when developing your arguments, kind of the first step is, getting your position on the issue and then brainstorming, thinking about reasons why people should logically accept your position. Then when building your arguments, what you want to do is this. Rather than taking like lots of tiny undeveloped arguments, it's better to have a few, maybe even just one or two or three well-developed arguments. Because a whole bunch of, weak undeveloped arguments won't get you a lot of points. The idea is basically they're based on their quality. So having a whole bunch of small undeveloped arguments that are kind of weak, will get you some points, but not as much as having, say, one or two or three really good arguments. So in general, it's better to focus on developing a few solid, well-developed arguments than just sheer number of arguments. Now, when arguing, the idea basically is to support your conclusion, or your overall conclusion will be your position on the issue with reasons. And as I mentioned before, there are other videos, and also we'll spend time in class going over how to actually argue. So to recap the argument section, it's worth 50 points. It should be 1,000 words or more. You need your case information, your position on the issue, arguments for your position, and that's basically how to build the argument section. Now the next part of the paper is the objection and reply part. It's worth 40 points and should be 500 words plus. Now with the word count thingy, I don't actually sit down and count every single word, but the idea basically is, so first, taking care of the Gordon rule requirement, and secondly, being able to make an effective case. And in general, when making an argument that's going to be good, you'll need a fair amount of words. So that's not 500 words just to make you fill up space. That's because pretty much that's about what it would take to raise at least a decent solid objection and reply to it. That'd be pretty minimally. So what goes in the objection reply section? Well, first, obviously enough, you got to have an objection or objections. An objection essentially is an argument that runs counter to your position. There's a couple ways to do this sort of generally. One option, and perhaps the best approach, is to argue against one of your own arguments, basically critically assess it. For example, if you've seen the video on argument by analogy, one way to criticize an argument by analogy would be to go using those standards and try to contend that your original analogy, that someone would object that maybe it doesn't meet those standards. Or if you're doing, say, an appeal to consequences. In that case, one obvious objection would be to present another assessment, basically arguing against your own argument. Now, a second general approach, rather than going after your own particular arguments, the second approach is just to argue against your position. So rather than criticizing your own arguments, basically objecting to them, the idea is to create new arguments against your position in favor of the opposition. And that's an option as well. Now you need at least one developed objection. More or better, but at least one is required. That's the bare minimum. And of course, the better the objection is, the better the grade. Now you also need to reply to the objection. And the reply basically involves countering that objection, basically showing why the objection doesn't actually hold. And of course you should be able to do this because presumably the reason why you hold the position you do is because you got better arguments for it than against it. So the basic idea is raise an objection, reply to the objection. If you're raising multiple objections, raise the second objection, reply to it. If you get a third one, raise a third one, reply to it. Now again, the grade is not based on number count. It's not basically a question of how many objections you have. It's a question of the quality. And be sure whenever you raise an objection, be sure to clearly and explicitly reply to it. Now when developing this, as I mentioned, in terms of being effective, one sort of key part of that is substantially developing the objection, presenting a substantial developed reply. And that's more effective than a whole bunch of undeveloped, poor arguments. So it's not a matter of sheer quantity of objections and replies, but of quality. And again, in terms of the arguing, the idea is basically to present a claim, the conclusion, and provide the premises, the reasons for that. And we'll spend, considerable time, in part one, both in videos and in class, going over how to argue. So to recap, the objection and reply, worth 40 points, should be 500 words plus. It's about 2 pages with normal formatting. It should have at least one substantial objection and your substantial developed reply to that. And of course, more developed objections and replies would be better. Now, how is the argument/objection and reply sections, how are they assessed? Well, basically, it breaks down into the following essential categories. First, does it do, the basic stuff? Do you have, all the parts, the argument section, the objection and reply to it? Do you present your position on the issue, to provide background for the case, etc.? Now, the baseline is a C level. That basically gets the job done. To use a food analogy, that's kind of like like an average restaurant. You go into someplace like, Ruby Tuesdays or TGI Fridays or something. It's a good mid-range place. Or, to use like a self-made meal, kind of like making yourself a decent meal, like a good sandwich or, maybe some pasta, something that's reasonably well done. Now, to get to the excellent level, the idea there basically is you clearly and concisely present your position on the issue, you present effective and well-developed arguments, you present, each section as a coherent whole, you clearly present how the argument impacts the overall issue. It's extremely well organized. In other words, everything is excellent. And that gets you, all the points. A good argument section in the B range does most of what an excellent section does, but has some minor flaws. Obviously it states your position, presents basic arguments that are relevant, it includes, the objection and reply, but it's not, not excellent. So it's good, but not excellent. An adequate one basically, again, gets the job done. It doesn't have any major flaws. It gets the stuff done, does what it's supposed to, but doesn't achieve a level of goodness. Now, getting into the bad section, a poor section has got some problems. Maybe it doesn't clearly state your position. The arguments are weak or poor. Perhaps it's got some fallacies, poorly organized, incomplete. Has other major flaws or many numerous flaws. It's not like failing, but it's pretty bad. To use the restaurant analogy, or to use a food analogy, it's kind of like pizza that's been in your fridge for like 4 or 5 days. It's not yet like dangerous, but it certainly isn't good. Now, failing argument, objection reply section has got, bad stuff, all through it. It's very poor, it's got fallacies, it's unclear, poorly presented, poorly organized, incomplete, has other major flaws. Otherwise, in other ways, very defective. So those are basically the ways of assessing it, ranging from excellent to failing. Now, there are also, when writing the argument and objection reply section, there are various common mistakes that can be made. One common mistake is to write a report rather than do an actual argumentative moral paper. A report merely presents information about the subject. Now, while you need to provide the reader with information, the main objective is to argue for your position, and then in the objection reply section, object to it, reply to it. And so a report will get you at most 10 points for that section. And so if it just goes on and on with information and reporting, that's going to get 10 points rather than the full points. A second common mistake is writing a compare and contrast paper. This involves merely comparing and contrasting various views on the issue. While it's acceptable and required, in fact, to consider objections to your view in the paper, your goal is to defend your position, not compare and contrast differing views of differing people on it. So you're, presenting your position, arguing for it, raising at least one substantial objection, replying to it, which is quite different from comparing and contrasting differing views. A third common mistake is to have assertions without arguments, to simply make claims, to say things like cheating is wrong or lying is wrong, without actually giving reasons for it. In other words, without arguing. It's also common for people to present arguments that are not moral arguments. For example, a person might argue against cheating by mentioning all the health risks, saying, well, you shouldn't cheat because you might get STDs, you might get, hurt, you might get your car keyed, you might get your stuff, destroyed. Now, those are all practical reasons not to cheat. Don't cheat if you don't want to get, the herpes or gonorrhea or AIDS. But that's not really a moral argument. If someone doesn't cheat because they're afraid of getting, herpes, they're not a good person. They're just afraid of getting herpes. And so you need to present a moral argument. And in the discussion of the moral methods and the various argument types, we looked at how to, and we'll look at, how to develop an actual moral argument. So especially watch for merely like arguing, but not having a moral argument. And kind of a general guide, if the paper doesn't even contain the word ethics or morality, then that's a good indicator there's no moral argument. Now, another common mistake is to have a topic that's not approved, typically one that is obviously not an ethical topic. This often occurs when people are trying to recycle a paper from another class, from say a religion class or psychology class or political science, etc. Now, if the paper is on an ethics topic and it's a moral ethical paper, that's fine. The typical thing that happens is someone might write on, say, the legalization of marijuana, a fairly popular one, and they'll go and argue at great length why marijuana should be legal. And it could be a very good paper about the legality of marijuana, for example. But of course, writing a paper about legality is not an ethics paper. Now, you could write a paper about the ethics of legalizing something, which would make it an ethical paper, but merely arguing that something should be legal would not be a moral paper. As another example, a person might write a paper about why, say, allowing broader adoption laws, like allowing same-sex couples to adopt, would allow more people to be adopted. And it would, say, help deal with the problem of children who aren't adopted. Now, of course, by itself, saying, this provides a practical solution to the adoption problem would not be a moral argument. What is needed is something to show that this would be morally right. Now, that can be done. It's very easy to transform pretty much any non-moral argument into a moral argument. But of course, to be a moral argument, it's got to be a moral argument. And with each of the methods, we'll look at how to do that. Now, probably the most common, or not the most common, but a very common grade killer is, and the most fatal one is, plagiarism. So the idea basically is to make sure you don't plagiarize, and that involves making sure that anything you get from another source that you properly cite, and that the work that you present is your own. And your grade depends on, the work that you do, and not the work of others. So plagiarism is definitely something to be avoided, especially something to be avoided in ethics class. Interestingly enough, or boringly enough, over the years I've gotten the most cases of plagiarism in ethics, and the number one plagiarized topic, ironically enough, is about cheating in classes. So a nice bit of irony there. Now the final part of the paper is the conclusion of the paper, part 4. It's basically a repeat or retread of the introduction. Just like the introduction is worth 5 points, it should be 125 words or less. And in terms of the content, what you can do, here's the easy way to do it. Take your intro, copy it, paste it. Then change your tense from, I will to I did, from, what I will do to what I've done. So your thesis would be, for example, instead of saying the purpose of this essay is to discuss and assess the morality of charging larger airline passengers extra for their flights, simply change it to something like this. The purpose of this essay was to discuss and assess the morality of charging larger airline passengers extra for their flights. Now, the other change, aside from the tense, is you replace the minimal background with some final relevant remark. For example, it could be something like this. While airlines should really provide larger seats, the practical and ethical solution for now is to charge the large. So the conclusion includes basically the following main points. It's worth 5 points. It should be 125 words or less. It should contain your thesis statement, your case statement, your position statement, your argument statement, and your final relevant remark. If the 5 points are there, you get 5 points. If not, not. The last thing for the paper, in the paper guide, there's a handy thing called the comment and checklist sheet. Now, the checklist is basically kind of a run through, for your own purposes to make sure you're not missing any points needlessly. Like things like making sure that you get all the, 4 sections labeled, making sure that you've, got, everything properly cited, etc. Now, also there, perhaps the most important part, are the comment codes. One thing I found, having taught for years and years and years, is that when I look at drafts, or final versions, I tend to say the same thing over and over again. Things like, this needs to be better organized, or you need to develop this more, or, well, this is an argument, it's not a moral argument. And since my handwriting is really crappy, and also because I send the same thing over and over again, what I've come up with is a code system. So when you get a draft back, or if you do a printed version of the final paper, you'll have codes on there like O1 or A4 or P2. And what those refer to is the comment codes in the paper guide. So for example, if it says O2, that means this needs to be better presented. If it says like A4, it says delete this, this does not need to be in the paper. If it says P2, that's the bad one, it says this is plagiarism. So that's what the comment codes mean. So when you get your paper back and it's got all these letters and numbers on it, that's what those mean. Now, the grade on the paper, of course, is the sum of the total. Namely, the grade is, add the introduction, the argument section, objection, reply section, the conclusion section, and you get that grade. If you turned in your final version of the paper by the bonus deadline, you get 5 points tagged on there. If you turn it in by the emergency deadline, you get the full score. If you turn it in by the 50% deadline, you get that score divided by half. And I'll put the grade there. Now, in the paper guide, there's also a complete sample paper, which will provide a decent guide to what the paper should look like. It shows basically how you organize the paper into parts. It shows what should be in the introduction for the particular paper, what should be in the conclusion, shows like what a argument section looks like, how to build an objection, how to reply to it. It's a good idea to look at that to see the sort of paper I'm looking for. Now, of course, you shouldn't copy that paper because that would be plagiarism, but it's in there. So that brings us to the end of the look at the paper.